Well, as an economist, I want to add a note because my research was why Britain invested in the New World in the way she did, namely in very safe bonds and securities instead of, especially to governments, railroads and so on, rather than buying equities and owning the New World. We just lent to it. I seem to miss an extraordinary business opportunity there, and I wondered why, and that's what my research was on. And of course it comes into the sphere I was into, which was international trade and finance. I mean, even from the beginning, Dad was a manager of stockbrokers and gave me some sort of vague contact with that world, you know. Currency speculations, interesting period of history to live through myself, in that I was, T-boy in effect in Rothschild's merchant bank, just for a few months really, a couple of times. Investment department and stock department, stock meaning stocks and shares. And foreign exchange, well, it was a world of battling to keep fixed exchange rates, sterling especially, the British currency, pound, and the rise of the dollar in importance, and then there was the general background history going on of the US shifting and everyone getting off of gold standard and floating exchange rates, and what the effect would be, and how finance is directed given the price of finance, which of course is the interest rate paid on loans or debts, whichever way you like to look at them, and the role of the central banks, and of course from the Titanic disaster onwards, we've had the rise in supremacy of central banking system and whoever runs it. And that's not clear at times. In a sense, it doesn't need to be, because one just wants to be clear on the consequence of such. And so we were using interest rates violently to influence exchange rates. If you put your interest rate up, then you attract foreign funds to your economy because they want the high interest rate, and that means they're demanding your currency, and it strengthens on the market vis-a-vis other currencies. So you could defend your currency by putting your interest rate up, which of course murdered physical growth in your economy, because now it's very costly to borrow, and firms therefore had difficulty, shortage of cash, couldn't shift it appropriately to markets. Massive unemployment, distress, unrest. What do you do about this? Lower the interest rate, exchange rate suffers. Who suffers? Well, the rich, in that their currency is not worth so much abroad. And all foreign goods are over expensive. So you impoverish your economy by defending an exchange rate that's too high. Yeah. So it does look quite complicated, but it's fairly logical stuff. You can't predict terribly, you can predict directions in economics, but how significant the change will be is hard to say, because there are all sorts of feedbacks and changes going on that you're not taking account of in your reasoning, in your modelling of what's going on. You know, a model is just a sophisticated way of, in mathematics, of trying to reason out as simply and as clearly as you can. But the simplifications themselves lead you greatly astray in what you predict. And the quantitative effect of everything you do is extremely hard to predict. I mean, uncertainty reigns. We're not masters of the show, and professional we may be, whether we're economists or financiers or bankers or politicians, but competent to actually manage it, we are not. And sometimes we manage it so badly that there's a revolution or there's a war, and everything's up for grabs. And disastrous for humanity, of course. We're children playing with fire. And we need a good parent, kind and loving parent, and competent to guide us. Wisdom had it in the past, it seems, or at least the historicity is that we had it, in having a notion of God. And then there was the problem of, well, what values does this God have? And it was easier to go for obedience rather than love. It was clearer. Machiavelli said, you know, you can rely on people who are in fear of you, but you can't rely on people that love you. They may change their love tomorrow, shift on to someone else. So we keep society in fear. And Christianity was very useful in this regard. Well, in fact, all religions are. They keep the population conforming and predictable and manageable, obedient. But of course, if you're looking at life not from the macro point of view, but the micro point of view, the individual, it's not a happiness. And, you know, in economic terms, the markets may just not work properly. You may get anything but an ideal distribution of resources and so on for whatever your values are. And the distress can bring such unrest, like economic depression and so on, the 1930s, or, well, it's been argued for the last few hundred years, but it's been for the last few thousand years since we had a market economy. You know, the previous system was a sort of barter system, and you can't imagine much degree of sophistication to come of this. So our departure from such to a monetary system has been an incredible impact, well, on simply physical productivity and technology, and therefore our lives and our culture and everything else. Sorry, this recording's come onto a very grandiose scale, hasn't it? But then many of these subjects, you know, that we think of in academia are incredibly grandiose. You know, we thought that physics and chemistry and that sort of thing, the physical sciences were impressive, but what the social sciences are dealing with is life and death, both of nations and of the individual. Staggering. In parallel with this, we've got the development of sciences of the individual, not just physical medicine, but psychology, psychiatry. And we used to have spirituality. But it's not clear that spirituality handled it better, but only clear that we don't look to that anything like as much in our wisdom as perhaps we used to. It's not clear. It's maybe a historicity, and the reality was a Machiavellian world that was anything but spiritual. I'm going to leave it at that. It's not whatsoever's good and lovely thinking on these things. Have I abandoned my training then? No, I've just stepped into a different world where it's not quite the problem, but actually the blessing that God has given us, which is novel, if not ridiculous, view to hold in the world's eyes, from the world's point of view. That the chaos, the uncertainty we experience here is in fact a blessing because it gives us a freedom to experience the consequence of what we are in terms of our values, individually and nationwide too. And we then, in the passage of time, adjust our values according to our experience. And the hope is, of course, that this leads to something wonderful, which we see very dimly as material prosperity, but perhaps break through into seeing it brilliantly in terms of life, fullness of life, life eternal. Jesus' story was meant to add something absolutely wonderful to this, to emphasize quite simply that God could be seen as our heavenly dad that loves us, all-powerful and all-loving. And it is found that taking this view is both miraculous in itself and in its outcome, but you can only prove it in the doing, not in the analysis. The analysis has a million pitfalls of misunderstanding to be overcome, whereas the doing of it is final and absolute. For if you taste something and it tastes good, a man's mind is made up. He likes that. That's what he wants. And he's only going to change his mind when he's tasted it and found it doesn't work. Which has been the case of many religions that have come and gone, and different variants on religions that are still with us. Actually, even modern secularism in the West is a variant on Christianity. It's a bit like Christianity but without the God in it. How's that for an oxymoron? A contradiction. But we're left with much of Christian ethics and values in a society that's battling to have a secular value system, political correctness, in fact. But you see, for a moment, I'd lost the word political correctness. You could say, it's his age, it's dementia, but it's not. Suddenly you get, what's the word for that, And you just blank on something that normally would be to hand. Well, I just put it another way and said modern value system without God and political correctness. The phrase just came into my mind again. So I said it here in the recording. Do you see how a trust, a confidence in God, that you have a problem for a good and blessed reason, leads you to act accordingly in trust, ways in which you would not have acted but for the supposition that God has it right, a trust, an assurance. And so you find you're doing things and going down roads that you would never go down but for your love of God. Your life is transformed. And I might say it's transformed way above and beyond what you held to be important and of value before. And this may be very threatening to material regimes and governments and so on. So they may want to grab hold of a religion and steer it accordingly to their values. And they may have the physical power to do this. And you might say, this is terrible. Why doesn't God do something about it? And the trusting answer is because this enables people to do what they want, to be free, to experience the consequences of what they want, which changes their wants in the long run, of course. They learn by their unhappy experiences very often and adjust their values accordingly. So we find we do seek things like integrity and honesty and faithfulness and hope and meaning and love and joy and peace. And come to glory. We find life and life eternal ultimately. That's the true hope of the Jesus story, not the theology of the Christian religion. Because religion is still a childish attempt. And we hope and trust that the Jesus story is something of enlightenment. And you can only find out if it is by going down that road to see the consequences. And that's not the Christian road. The Jesus story is quite different. Read John 17 and you'll start to realize why. Thank you, Heavenly Dad. Well, I see I'm running 20 minutes. Dead on. 2 tens. Well, if 10 was the right foundation of principles of life, commandments, 20 is twice that of God. God's original provision for us. Numbers are meant to have meanings. What meanings you attribute to these numbers will determine whether the numbering becomes a blessing to you or a curse. So beware, dear one, whatsoever is good and lovely, think on these things, and all will be well. Bless you. Thank you, Heavenly Dad.